Once Upon a Time Project 2025 is a policy plan prepared by the Heritage Foundation and more than 100 partner organizations. It was released as a document called Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. The purpose is to prepare a governing agenda for a future conservative administration. The document is over 900 pages long. It outlines a detailed plan to reshape how the United States government operates. The plan includes policies for every federal department and major area of society. What follows is a summary of what the document proposes. These are the stated ideas and goals written in the plan itself. Part 1. Government and Power Structure. Project 2025 proposes expanding presidential authority over the executive branch. It calls for reclassifying tens of thousands of career civil service jobs into positions that can be replaced at will. It supports reviving a category called Schedule F to allow the president to remove federal employees more easily. It recommends centralizing decision-making in the White House and limiting independent agency power. It encourages the president to issue more executive orders to direct agencies. It suggests reducing oversight by Congress and the courts in administrative operations. It proposes a presidential personnel database to pre-screen conservative candidates for federal positions. It recommends establishing a presidential administration academy to train appointees before taking office. It favors shrinking or merging agencies to reduce what it calls the administrative state. It calls for stricter loyalty between political appointees and the president's agenda. Part 2. Federal Agencies and Bureaucracy. The document calls for major restructuring of federal departments. It recommends eliminating or transferring the Department of Education's functions to the states. It supports scaling back or merging the Environmental Protection Agency. It calls for significant reforms to the Department of Labor and reducing union influence. It proposes changing leadership structures in the FBI and the Department of Justice to ensure accountability to the president. It recommends simplifying the Internal Revenue Service and lowering corporate audits. It favors downsizing federal regulatory bodies and replacing rules with state-level discretion. It seeks to align agency missions with what it defines as traditional values and limited government. Part 3. Personnel and Staffing Project 2025 emphasizes building a new federal workforce. It calls for a permanent recruitment network of conservative professionals. It proposes an online database of vetted candidates for quick hiring. It promotes loyalty tests for key government positions. It recommends replacing current civil service protections with performance-based reviews set by political leadership. It seeks to ensure new appointees are ideologically aligned with the administration's goals. Part 4. Economy, Labor, and Markets. The document promotes expanding fossil fuel production and reducing federal climate regulations. It calls for ending subsidies for renewable energy programs. It recommends privatizing some Social Security and unemployment services. It supports cutting corporate taxes and lowering business regulation. It opposes federal increases to the minimum wage. It promotes right-to-work laws and limits collective bargaining rights. It proposes weakening the National Labor Relations Board. It encourages state control over worker protections instead of national mandates. It seeks to simplify the tax code and reduce the IRS's enforcement powers. It calls for eliminating several financial disclosure and corporate oversight rules. Part 5. Unions and Labor Structure. Project 2025 supports restricting public sector unions. It calls for removing automatic payroll deductions for union dues. It proposes barring union organizing inside federal workplaces. It encourages state laws that make union membership voluntary. It aims to reduce union involvement in political activity funded through dues. Part 6. Fiscal and Monetary Philosophy. The plan promotes a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. It calls for cutting federal spending, except for defense and border enforcement. It recommends reducing entitlement programs to control the national debt. It supports deregulating banks and investment markets. It encourages eliminating certain Dodd-Frank financial oversight rules. It calls for narrowing the Federal Reserve's role to price stability only. It discusses exploring a commodity-backed or sound money approach to currency policy. It seeks to prevent the Fed from using monetary tools for climate or social objectives. Part 7. society, culture, and identity. Project 2025 defines the family as the cornerstone of society. It promotes policies to encourage marriage and childbearing. It opposes federal recognition of gender identity beyond biological definitions. It calls for removing gender identity language from civil rights enforcement. It proposes ending federal funding for programs that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. It recommends withdrawing support for organizations that advance LGBTQ+ rights. It favors faith-based groups as partners in social services. It seeks to limit federal involvement in abortion access and reproductive health programs. It supports appointing judges who interpret the Constitution according to original meaning. It calls for restricting pornography and online material considered harmful to minors. Part 8. Education, Science, and Technology. The document proposes abolishing or reducing the Federal Department of Education. It supports transferring education authority to states and local school boards. It calls for parental rights laws governing school curricula. It promotes the teaching of Western civilization, faith, and traditional values. It opposes critical race theory and gender ideology in classrooms. It recommends removing federal requirements for student loan forgiveness. It supports re-expanding private lending markets for higher education. It proposes reducing federal oversight in scientific research funding. It encourages redirecting grants toward projects aligned with moral or national interests. It suggests limiting federal involvement in AI and biotechnology research that conflicts with ethical standards. Part 9. Environment, Energy, and Climate. Project 2025 calls for expanding oil, gas, and coal production on public lands. It recommends fast-tracking drilling and pipeline permits. It seeks to withdraw from international climate agreements. It calls for repealing carbon emission rules under the EPA. It proposes closing or defunding climate change offices within federal agencies. It supports eliminating federal incentives for electric vehicles and renewable power. It encourages energy independence through domestic fossil fuel output. It argues that market forces should determine environmental outcomes. It calls for reducing the role of the Department of Energy in regulating emissions. Part 10. Defense, Borders, and Security. The plan prioritizes military readiness and border security. It supports expanding the armed forces and increasing defense spending. It recommends using the military in domestic emergencies if necessary. It calls for strict immigration limits and accelerated deportations. It supports completing physical barriers along the southern border. It calls for ending sanctuary city policies. It proposes restricting refugee and asylum programs. It recommends using technology and private contractors for border enforcement. It seeks to limit U.S. participation in global peacekeeping missions. It favors a foreign policy centered on national sovereignty and self-interest. Part 11. Data, Surveillance, and Digital Governance. Project 2025 supports expanding federal authority to collect and share data across agencies. It calls for increased digital identification and verification for benefits programs. It proposes limiting private companies' ability to censor online content. It encourages stronger government oversight of social media platforms. It supports developing a digital ID system for citizens and lawful residents. It calls for stronger law enforcement access to encrypted communications. It supports revising privacy laws to prioritize security and parental control. It proposes restricting online platforms that distribute sexually explicit or extremist material. Part 12. Global Governance and Alliances. The document advocates reducing U.S. participation in multilateral institutions. It calls for reassessing involvement in the United Nations, the WHO, and the IMF. It proposes shifting from multilateral treaties to bilateral agreements. It supports renegotiating or exiting trade deals viewed as unfavorable. It encourages tariffs to protect domestic manufacturing. It recommends limiting foreign aid to nations aligned with U.S. interests. It supports stronger trade ties with allies who share conservative values. It calls for decreasing funding for international climate and health initiatives. It favors prioritizing American sovereignty over global governance commitments. Part 13. Health, Welfare, and Social Services. Project 2025 calls for restructuring or reducing federal welfare programs. It proposes adding work requirements to food assistance and Medicaid. It supports transferring social programs to states and local charities. It encourages faith-based management of welfare services. It calls for restricting federal funding for Planned Parenthood. It supports greater private sector involvement in healthcare delivery. It promotes alternatives to the Affordable Care Act. It calls for expanding health savings accounts and market-based insurance models. Part 14. Law, Justice, and Civil Rights. The plan seeks to reshape the Department of Justice. It calls for focusing federal prosecution on crime, border, and drug enforcement. It recommends limiting civil rights investigations based on statistical disparities. It supports defining sex discrimination strictly as biological. It calls for ending federal enforcement of diversity mandates in hiring and education. It promotes originalist judges and narrowing the scope of federal courts. It supports increased use of the death penalty and mandatory sentencing. It proposes restoring local control over police oversight. Part 15. Communications and Media Project 2025 recommends reducing the independence of the Federal Communications Commission. It calls for preventing the FCC from imposing content moderation requirements. It supports allowing political and religious broadcasters more freedom. It calls for ending public-funded media such as NPR or PBS. It supports removing federal subsidies from digital news and media outlets. It encourages greater competition in the communications sector with fewer restrictions. Part 16. Agriculture, Food, and Rural Policy. The plan supports reducing federal farm subsidies. It calls for decentralizing agricultural programs to the states. It promotes private insurance for crops and livestock instead of federal programs. It supports eliminating environmental rules tied to farm operations. It calls for expanding rural energy and broadband projects through private investment. It supports deregulating meat inspection and food labeling standards. Part 17. Housing and Urban Development. Project 2025 calls for reducing federal involvement in housing markets. It proposes ending rent assistance expansion programs. It supports privatizing portions of federal housing finance. It calls for eliminating diversity and inclusion rules in urban planning. It promotes local zoning autonomy without federal intervention. It encourages market-driven housing development. Part 18. Transportation and Infrastructure. The plan supports devolving transportation funding to states. It recommends limiting the Department of Transportation's regulatory authority. It calls for privatizing parts of the air traffic control system. It supports expanding highway construction over public transit spending. It promotes public-private partnerships for major infrastructure projects. It seeks to end federal mandates tied to climate or equity criteria in transportation planning. Part 19. Veterans and Military Families. Project 2025 calls for streamlining the Department of Veterans Affairs. It supports privatizing portions of veterans' health care. It encourages outsourcing VA services to private hospitals. It proposes consolidating veterans' benefit programs for efficiency. It calls for expanding support for faith-based veteran organizations. Final thoughts. Project 2025 is a comprehensive plan to centralize power in the executive branch. It aims to reduce federal regulation, devolve authority to states, and expand private sector roles. It promotes traditional family values and restricts programs it views as progressive. It redefines the role of federal government around national sovereignty, energy independence, and moral conservatism. Its supporters see it as a path to efficiency and renewal. Its critics see it as a transformation of democratic governance. The document presents a blueprint, not yet law but ready for implementation. Project 2025 is not a campaign speech. It is a full instruction manual for government. The next episode examines what parts of this blueprint have already become reality and which remain as possibilities waiting to unfold. Because understanding the plan is only the first step. The future is what happens when the blueprint meets power.